the TTF is a collaborative campaigning community dedicated to reforming the way the financial system works. Our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And our vision is to build a highly respected, and for me, those two words are very, very important. We're looking to build a highly respected, international, influential institution that is dedicated to ensuring that consumers are treated fairly. And that really does chime so well with the theme of tonight, because as you know, John's book is all about treating consumers fairly. There's a really strong resonance between the mission of the TTF and John's work, not just in terms of his book, but also for how he's been spending the last few decades of his career. And when we
I'll
invite John to talk a bit about his background before becoming an author of a very credible book. So that's a bit about me and the Transparency Task Force. We are recording this session. There are others who wanted to join it but weren't able to. So we will be putting this out on social media. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. I really am. It's just gone 6 p.m. UK time. We'll be wrapping up at about 7, there or thereabouts. Let's now go to Kim to invite Kim to introduce herself. Kim, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kim Schweitzer, founding an organization called Time for Change London, focusing on corporations' purpose, organizations' purpose, living values authentically. My background is in total rewards, and I've been very, very focused throughout my career, mostly working in M&A and executive compensation on fairness. And so very interested in joining tonight's discussion. I'm also an ambassador for TTF and volunteer as well for TTF. And Andy likes to call me LinkedIn Kim because I'm helping him facilitate his LinkedIn messages, invites, and conversations. So you might be hearing from me one day in the future.
Thank you very much.
If you haven't already.
Thank you very much, Kim. Kim's doing a great job. We've realized that one of the ways of handling the harsh reality that we don't have much resource is to recruit lots of people to help do different things and volunteer. And Kim's a shining example of that. Thank you very much, Kim. Let's now go to Jim. Jim, please take your time to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do. Thank you.
I'm Jim Bignell. I'm trying to promote the concept of responsible business, which means prioritizing people, planet, as well as profit. It's not an anti-profit position at all. To the contrary, I think if companies can't make a profit, they're not going to be invested in staff and decent wages and so on and so forth. And also, I'm really arguing for an holistic approach to it, starting right from the beginning of creating what I call a great workplace culture, which is fair and fair pay and good well-being and all that sort of thing. Because I think from a great workplace culture, amazing things can be achieved. Thank you.
Jim. Thank you, Jim. Jim, I'm very curious to know what you did before you do what you now do. What was your background, Jim?
I ran a corporate hospitality company, which is really, I don't know whether you're aware of the taking people to organising trips to Wimbledon and to Twickenham and to Wembley for businesses. It's probably in many respects not the most ethical thing to be in. But I remember asking my father when I was thinking of starting the business, he said, well, if you don't, somebody else will. Well, that was good enough for me. But what is quite interesting is that I think I can see both sides of the story, because we did one or two things that weren't illegal, but looking back on it, I think they might have been slightly unethical. And when people ask me, would I do it again? I think probably the answer would have been yes, if the business was in the sort of financial state that it was. So, you know, these are big challenges. How to run a business ethically is extremely challenging.
Jim, thank you so much for your honesty. I can really relate to what you're talking about there. My own background for the first roughly 10 years was in frontline sales and sales management in financial services. And the various organisations I worked for were all the same. They would use every means possible to encourage attention, attraction, engagement, inducements. I guess you could even use that word, to get favour. It was a very competitive market. And at the time, it all seemed quite normal. You know, tickets to Wimbledon, tickets to the FA Cup final, all that kind of stuff. Looking back, we probably would look at it in a different way. So, Jim, I really appreciate and respect your candour. Thank you very much. Let's now go to Joanne, who we've got to know Joanne very, very well in recent months. Joanne, please introduce yourself. And if you don't mind, talk a little bit about how, just very briefly, a bit about what your experience has been in recent years, because I think that will chime with some of the messages that John's going to share. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. I'm Joanne. I'm a bank whistleblower and a volunteer and member of the TTF. Very delighted to have come across the TTF. I've been reading John's book and I'm about halfway through. Unfortunately, I didn't get your book until quite late, John, but I'm very impressed with it. It's just, I can see you've got legal training. It's very succinct and brilliantly supported all your claims. But what I do find is it chimes so much with what my experience was as a whistleblower. And it's strangely enough, when I raised my whistle to the FCA about the misselling and overcharging on consumer credit on loans at point of sale, one of the things I said to them is that, you know, if it's not addressed and this bank does what it does, it affects the market, because, you know, if one is going to take this advantage, a bit like the Darwin fit and strongest survive, then the others are going to do the same. And that's how our markets are affected. If we let one get away with it and they're making great profits, the only way to compete is to do the same thing. So I've been really enjoying your book, and it definitely chimes with me. It totally reinforces, it actually, I think, gives me confidence that what I was saying from raw experience very much is portrayed in the research you've done and the work you've done. And it's so readable for anyone. It's not technical. And I think that's often where whistleblowers go wrong. We often get too technical. We're too used to the technical jargon in the workplace. And so we don't always come across as understandable just to anybody in the street. And they don't really understand the impact of what we're trying to explain, because we don't explain it well enough. I think you do a superb job. So thank you very much for your book, and I look forward to
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Very good indeed. Let's now go to Mek Gupta. Forgive me, Mek, if I haven't pronounced your name correctly, but please do take a moment to introduce yourself to us, Mek. Thank you.
Okay, good evening. Actually, I haven't got much to say, really. My name is Mek, and I come from the business family, and I used to work in finance. I just want to join in to learn more about, you know, everything regarding finance, transparency and everything, just horizon broadening my mind. And because recently I had a bad fall and I have head injury and brain injury, so I just try to not to become something like dementia and brain damage, you know. Yeah,
Okay.
so I just love to join in. Thank you very much for having me. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mek. That's another reason why people are getting involved with the TTF beyond everything we've heard before, Mek. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us. Let's now go to Karl. Karl, we can't see you, but I'm hoping we can hear you once you've taken yourself off mute. Thank you for doing that. Thanks, Karl.
Hello, hi there. So I'm trying to put my camera on, actually. I'm not sure it's going to work, actually, now.
Yeah. Give it a go.
While he's sorting himself out, I know Karl quite well.
Okay.
Yeah, but John will probably say it's probably a good job you can't see me. Actually, yeah. I used to work.
Not at all.
I worked for a number of years with John on a governance committee, one which had a very strong focus on looking after customers. So very pleased to be able to join and hear John talk about his very interesting book and learning more about your activities.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you very much. If you can get yourself onto camera, that would be good. It just makes it a little bit more sociable. But what we're going to do now, of course, is to pass over to John, who's going to introduce himself, talk a bit about his background, his motivation for writing the book in the first place, the key messages, and then we'll just open it up from there. And John, have you got any slides that you're going to be sharing with us today?
No, in the end, I didn't get the time to do it, Andy, but perhaps I can just sit and talk and hopefully interest people by doing that.
I'm sure you'll be able to do that very well indeed. John, over to you. Take your time.
I chair the advisory group for TTF. Largely what we do is persuade Andy to try and take less time in the business and more time at home, because he's a whirlwind of energy and dynamism and is constantly taking on new jobs, but he's brilliant at it. And so we try and help him in everything he's doing. Just as a bit of background, I was a BBC broadcaster for 30 years, mainly doing consumer programs, actually, which is where I got into the whole notion of how consumers are treated. I joined something called the Financial Services Consumer Panel, which was the regulator's consumer panel, and ended up chairing that. And that was at about the time or just before the banking crash. So there was a lot going on at that time, which I was privy to. I was also on the board of the Financial Ombudsman Service, which I think has been an extraordinarily powerful mechanism for consumers who have problems with financial services firms. Has been very influential. Then I was a non-executive director at Ofgem, which is the energy regulator, and saw the energy market through a transition and a very controversial area when they became public enemy number one after the banks had fallen from that perch. And there was a big mis-selling scandal in the energy sector. I was also a non-executive director at the Family Building Society for just over 10 years. And that gave me an insight into the mechanisms inside an organization rather than being outside or in a regulator trying to dictate to firms what they should be doing. At present, I'm a non-executive director at the Banking Competition Remedies, which is a rather unusual organization, a bit like Dragon's Den, if you've seen that on TV, where they give money away to companies that look as if they're going to be successful. Banking Competition Remedies has had £775 million to give away, and 4 of us directors have been deciding which challenger banks and fintechs to give that money to. This is part of the EU's decision that after the banking crash, the Royal Bank of Scotland had got too much state aid, and that they had to give away some of their money to competitors, and that's what we've been doing. We've been giving away £775 million to fintechs. Jim, you've got a question?
John, have you been invited to Wimbledon by anybody?
We've had to be very careful about who, to be honest, and the dealings we have.
I bet.
There have been a lot of people trying to get in touch with us to say, well, can we have some of this money? And we've had to go through a very rigorous process to make sure that it was all done fairly. I also chair the customer engagement group of Scottish Power Energy Networks. Now, this is also a new sort of idea. It's a way of injecting the customer's views into the business plans of our energy companies, but I'll talk perhaps a little bit about that later on. I'm really interested in why consumer markets seem to regularly fail, what causes it and what can be done about it, and also how to get companies to behave more fairly by developing some sort of corporate conscience using customer engagement. And that was really what the Independent Governance Committee that was referred to earlier, and the Lloyds Banking Group with Profits Committee. Karl was on the Independent Governance Committee with me at Lloyds Banking Groups, basically Scottish Widows and Clerical Medical. The Independence Governance Group Governance Committee was there to make sure that in the market for workplace pensions, the pensioners were treated fairly. That was what it was all about. So we were there to inject that independence into the way the company operated and was handling those workplace pensions. The essence of the book, I guess, is my view of why markets fail and those customer scandals that seem to regularly crop up. My view is that it's nearly always due to mis-selling of one sort or another. the more unregulated markets are, where you have buyers and sellers. I'm just talking about retail markets. Where you have unregulated markets, they'll always exhibit mis-selling, in my view. Most of the big financial upheavals that we've seen are caused, I think, by mis-selling. And if we could take effective measures to stop mis-selling, we could make the financial road much less bumpy, and avoiding catastrophic effects for some people, such as losing their homes. I think mis-selling comes about through the same evolutionary forces that Darwin identified in his famous book. That's why I've called it Darwin and the Naked Market. And that makes, I think, Darwin a better economist than Adam Smith. So I'll explain why I think that too. In the book, I look at the loss of confidence in experts. That might now be slightly being redressed, I guess, by the role that experts have played in the pandemic. Perhaps we'll at least have experts in the medical field commanding a little bit more respect, but whether that will trail off into other experts, I don't know. They've had a bit of a battering in the last 10, 15 years. I look at the definition of fairness. It's incredibly difficult to define, and I look at why that is. I look at the effect of selling and marketing in the marketplace and the way that might distort things. Whether regulation has failed us, we've got a lot of regulators now in telecoms, in water, in energy, in financial services. Are they doing the job that we need them to do? Are we almost setting them up to fail in the way they've been established? And also whether we can create a corporate conscience inside companies so we don't need to worry so much about regulating them. They do the right thing themselves. That's an interesting idea, and I hope we'll talk a little bit more about that. Finally, the book talks about the effect of new technology on mis-selling in the future and how new technology can help consumers to make better decisions, better choices, and protect them from falling foul of bad offers and companies that are misbehaving. Let's just have a look at where I get to on Adam Smith and Darwin. Adam Smith said the business owner intends only his own gain, and he is in this led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Smith's idea was that the end which was no part of his intention was lower prices, innovation, more choice, so an improvement for society generally. That's not what the business owner intended, but it's simply the competitive pressures which force that to happen. There's a lot of truth in it, I think. You can leave companies to get on with competing, and that will be the right outcome. Technical advances that we've had, technological advances in the last 30, 50, 100 years point to that. And you can just look at the choice in supermarkets to see that if you leave competitive forces to work, it improves choice and increases innovation. Darwin, on the other hand, said about evolution that owing to the struggle for life, any variation, however slight and from whatever cause, if it's in any degree profitable to an individual, will tend to the preservation of that individual. In other words, in competition, it's the fittest who survive. I think it's great that he used the word profitable, because you can substitute company quite easily then. Owing to the struggle for survival, any variation, however slight, and from whatever cause, if it is in any degree profitable to a company, will tend to the preservation of that company. And if you look at what dictates the survival of companies, I've split it into 4 areas, and it's the 4th, I think, which is the really interesting one and draws the distinction between Darwin and Smith. First of all, there's financial strength. The company that eats its weaker competitors. Take over an uneconomic manufacturer of bottle openers, for example. That's the financial strength coming into operation. Efficiency, that's a company that produces a cheaper bottle opener. And then there's innovation, the company that produces a better bottle opener. And then the 4th one, this distinction between Smith and Darwin. Companies can survive and prosper, we see this, by deceiving purchasers into thinking they are getting something they are not. As Darwin said, any variation, good or bad, if it's in any degree profitable, will aid preservation. So a bottle opener said to be better, but which doesn't work. They've been missold, and Darwin, I think, points that up as a potential effect in his development of his theories. I don't think Adam Smith addresses that at all. So what Darwin spotted, but Smith missed, was that in a naked market, companies can survive and thrive by deceiving customers, misselling. Unscrupulous firms with an uncompetitive offering can compromise on quality or trick customers into buying inferior products to stay in the game. Now, in the book, I look at 3 market failures. The first one, the big one, the banking crash, which I think came down to the misselling of mortgages. There are other people have other views about this. I agree with the way The Big Short, that film, looked at it. What was happening was that mortgage brokers were going round and persuading people to take out mortgages when they really couldn't afford it. They were missold, those mortgages. The brokers took about £2,000 off each one of those deals they did. There was a huge incentive to sell them to anyone who they could persuade to take them on. When property prices in the US started to flatten out, this meant that a lot of people were going to be in negative equity and also in debt. And this led eventually, when all those mortgages totaled up, and there were many, many hundreds of thousands of them, it caused the banking crash, which had effects worldwide. The next one that I looked at was energy misselling. This happened about the same time as the banking crash. What was happening was the energy retailers were going around door to door and using increasingly dodgy techniques to persuade people to change their energy supplier. When these dodgy techniques became known to their competitor companies, of course, they thought, oh, well, they're doing well, we'll try that. What was happening is that they were persuading people to change their energy supplier, and many of them were ending up paying more money than they were previously paying for their electricity and gas. So nearly all of the energy companies were taken to task by the energy regulator for this, and I actually sat on one of the disciplinary hearings in front of half a dozen QCs and other lawyers and a huge phalanx of people from the particular energy company involved to talk about how they'd got themselves into this position. So it was a real inside view of what had happened to produce this terrible case of mis-selling, really. The third case I looked at was the mis-sale of PPI, payment protection insurance. This was insurance usually sold alongside a loan, so that if you could no longer pay your loan, then the insurance paid it for you. Very valuable for things like a mortgage, because it would stop you losing your house in those circumstances if you lost your job or something like that. So it wasn't a bad product in some circumstances, but it was really badly missold. People ended up taking out these insurance policies. It was added to their mortgage. It was accumulating increasingly in the debt that they were mounting up. And it was a really bad effect. In fact, at that time, a lot of the banks, high street banks, were selling payment protection insurance alongside loans, and 95% of their profit at one period was coming from the sale of insurance, this payment protection insurance. And that's why none of them could stop doing it. Why would any one of the 6 high street banks stop selling payment protection insurance when it was providing 95% of their retail income? In fact, the first one that did it would lose all its business to the others. So there was an incentive, a built incentive for them not to get out of selling payment protection insurance. You will notice these are not dodgy backstreet traders getting involved in mis-selling. These are some of the biggest corporate names. It's Barclays, it's Scottish and Southern Energy, it's the Royal Bank of Scotland. So how do we deal with this? Why are these major corporations acting so unfairly, and what can we do about it? What is needed is either for us to be able to look at a company's trading practices and decide if it's operating fairly, and then the regulator can take action, or are customers getting a deal is the question we're asking, or for the companies themselves to be able to judge what fairness is and to do something about it before the regulator hits them with a fine or whatever. The trouble is, it's very difficult to decide what fairness is. To me, when you think about it, fairness appears to be a sort of emotional reaction to a situation. So it's not necessarily a logical reaction, it's an emotional reaction. And in fact, what we usually react to is unfairness. We feel, oh, that we've been unfairly treated. We don't react to fairness. That's what we expect. But we react when whatever we're experiencing turns out to be unfair in our eyes. So that makes it quite a difficult thing to make judgments about. We don't have a good definition of fairness, in other words. In the book, I suggest that fairness is what the majority of people, armed with all the facts, would say was fair. There are various reasons why I come down to that, but that's my definition of fairness. And it's then how you apply that. If we're trying to get companies to do something about the way they behave, then I think that what you need to do is to create a corporate conscience. And we were talking about the Independent Governance Committee. My view is that that was a form of corporate conscience. We, Karl and I, were sitting on the Independent Governance Committee of Scottish Power. We were listening to what they were doing. We were hearing them explain why they were doing it. And we came to an independent judgment of our own about whether we felt that was fair for the pensioners of Scottish widows. The Financial Services Consumer Panel was the first group like this that I sat upon. That was the regulator's consumer panel. So we sat there, we had the opportunity to talk to anyone in the regulator and ask them why they felt they were doing things, and to make a judgment for ourselves whether we thought that that was fair to customers. But in fact, what happened most of the time was the regulator came to us and said, this is what we're thinking of doing. Is it fair? And we would say, well, on behalf of consumers, yes, we think that's fair. This was a really good way of doing it, because in the past, the only way for the regulator to behave was to decide to introduce rules, perhaps by consulting the industry, and then deciding what those rules were going to be. And if consumers afterwards discovered that it was not very helpful or useful or fair to them, then the only way of trying to do anything about it was by going to the press or forming some sort of campaign and getting it overturned. And once the regulator had made up its mind, it really didn't want to be forced out of changing its mind. But having the consumer panel inside the organization meant that we could talk to them ahead of them making up their mind and persuade them to do something about it if we felt it wasn't fair. So it was a very good device, being inside the organization. And that's where I take it to with companies. If you can put that sort of corporate conscience, consumer group inside of some of these big organizations, then you can have that effect as well. You can persuade companies before they get into a public situation where backtracking will not look appealing to them, that what they're doing is unfair. Some of the banks and building societies have tried this in the past, and it has worked, but it's not something that we do generally. There have been moves to introduce this sort of idea in some of our organizations, and they've also tried it in the States. It happens more in Germany, in fact, where they have a different sort of corporate structure. They have a board, a main board, and then a sub board, which often that sub board contains customers and also representatives of the union on it as well, the trades union for the firm. So stakeholder committee, if you like, and that expresses its view to the main board. So I think that's quite a good way of doing it. 1831 there, Andy, I'm looking at my clock. Shall I just say one more thing about the way technology may change all this? There is a real shift happening, and you probably noticed this, especially in markets like the energy sector, where you can now join an organization, give it permission for them to change your energy supplier. It will search the market for you, find the best deal, and change you over to that best deal automatically. We're constantly told to look, search the market, find the best deal, make sure that you're always on the best deal. Well, this sort of software can now find that deal for you, but you have to hand over the authority for it to change your bank account details so that you can then pay a new vendor. This is happening throughout the marketplace. And if you think of all of those areas where we're fed up with having to search the marketplace all the time, insurance for cars, insurance for houses, all of that sort of thing, it'll all move that way, where you can, if you want to, provide your authority to a company to go and find the best deal for you. I think that that has tremendous possibilities, because that bit of software that's operating for you can check whether it's the best deal. So you won't be missold by a salesman who tells you you're going to save you thousands. It's going to save you thousands when it doesn't. So they will do that hard work for you. They will authenticate that better deal and check the small print to make sure that you're not being led down a path you don't really want to go down. It does mean a new role for all regulators in ensuring that that bit of software really is doing what it says on the tin. That will be the new regulatory responsibility. But this new technology, I think, does provide a fantastic opportunity for consumers to be able to say, I don't want to be bothered with all that anymore. That bit of software is going to be better at searching out good deals for me and making sure I don't fall foul of the pitfalls. So I think that's going to produce a very interesting situation in the future and could help us all avoid some of the mis-selling. Andy.
John, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and talk about. Before we move on to opening this up with questions and comments, I'd like us all please to just show our appreciation to John for setting out so clearly why he's written his book and what it's all about. Well done, John. That was great.
Thank you.
That really was great. You're wonderful. You're a wonderful speaker. I'm sure people have got things they'd like to say in response to what John's been setting out. Please just raise your hand if you'd like to go first. Who'd like to go first? If not, I've certainly got a question for John. Let's go to Jim first of all, then we go to Joanne, then to Kim. We'll do it in that order. Jim, please take yourself off mute. Thank you.
Thank you for that, John. And I will purchase a book tomorrow. I hope it can be purchased on an organisation other than Amazon. But anyway, that's another matter. One of the things that I think is not talked about in this whole sort of space that we're talking about is ethics. And I just wonder whether an ethical approach to making these decisions might be better than a fair one, because everybody has different opinions about what fairness is. It might be fairness to make somebody redundant for the benefit of everybody else who isn't being made redundant, but it won't be perceived to be a fair thing by the person who is being made redundant. So it's really very much a matter of opinion. But I think if an organisation has a code of ethics, then I think decisions can be made on the basis of that. And also, I believe that political parties should have codes of ethics. But it doesn't seem to be mentioned or mentioned very infrequently. And also, I think that we perhaps need more Joannes. I don't know what you went through, Joanne, and I don't know whether it's publicly available or whatever. But I know a lot of whistleblowers have a pretty unpleasant time. And it's my contention that employees, certainly new employees, should be obliged to sign a pledge of adherence to the code of ethics. I think it's very difficult to impose that on existing employees, although they should be strongly encouraged. I think new ones should be obliged. They just won't get the job. It's part of the terms and conditions of employment. They just won't get the job if they don't sign it. And I think if we can create a culture where somebody can say, if John says to Harry, I want you to do something, please can you put this sale into this month, even though it hasn't been confirmed, so that we hit our sales target, the team hits its sales target, he can say no, because it's an unethical thing to do, and I've signed a pledge that I won't behave in an unethical way. Nor should he be asked to do it, because the pledge would say, I'm nearly finished, the pledge would say, you can't, nor can you ask somebody to do anything that's unethical. And I feel that's the way forward, or a way forward. You know, I'd like to encourage a move towards people thinking about codes of ethics and pledges and values and this sort of thing. Sorry, I waffled a bit.
No, no, that's great. I've got no problem with codes of ethics. I think that's dealing with a slightly different problem. I'm looking at quite a narrow aspect here of retail markets, buyers and sellers, and what goes wrong. I think that's so often at the root of things that go wrong. But codes of ethics, I think, are good. The problem with all of these is that you have to have someone to adjudicate on whether that code has been broken. whether something is unfair, and then you have to have some sort of enforcement behind it. One of the problems, I think, with the financial regulator at the moment is that there is a duty on companies to treat customers fairly. Just as an aside, that's the first time when it was passed in 2000 that there was ever a requirement by a company to treat its customers fairly. Before that, the assumption was you could treat your customers unfairly, presumably. But now there is this specific requirement to treat customers fairly. It's a principle rather than a rule. That is not, I don't think, really used as often as it ought to be by the regulator. This is one of the weaknesses, I think, that the regulators have, that they can't move against principles like treating customers fairly as much as one might like. And that's resulted in a move now in the financial services sector to introduce another thing called a duty of care, so that companies must exhibit or follow a duty of care to their customers. When you start to unpick that, I don't think that really does much more than treating customers fairly. And if only they were enforcing treating customers fairly, you wouldn't have to have a duty of care. But there we are. That's another matter.
John, thank you so much for that response. And Jim, I personally found your comments very interesting indeed. I'm going to elaborate on why I found it so interesting, because a little while ago, the Transparency Task Force created yet another new group. We have 24 new groups now, and I'm sharing my screen to show you something. This is TTF's Global Financial Services Oath. It's a draft. You might be aware, Jim, and others, that in Australia, there is a banking and finance oath. It's not compulsory. In Australia, it's optional. And in Australia, you have to pay to sign up for it. But there are many, many hundreds, thousands of people in Australia who have made a professional commitment to an oath. In Holland, they've applied a different approach. The banking sector in Holland, it is mandatory, exactly like Jim said. If you join the banking sector in Holland, you make a professional undertaking, which is mandatory, to conduct yourself in a civilized, ethical, professional, fair way. And if you don't, that's it, you're struck off. And they say in Holland that it does positively influence conduct. So I won't go through this in any detail, but what we've basically got in TTF is the idea that there are 10 sort of ideal characteristics of what a professional oath should be. All of that's up for discussion. This is very much in draft form. But essentially it says the oath has got to actually make a difference. There's no point having it if it's not going to make a difference. And we've come up with just 2 sentences that we think cover all the important bits. So as you can see, it says, as a financial service professional, I hereby commit by way of the solemn professional oath that I shall always act in an ethical, transparent and trustworthy manner, and I shall accept the consequences if I do not. I recognize that my own conduct influences the behavior of others, and I know it's my professional duty to expose any wrongdoing that I encounter. The last sentence is, for me, very, very important. The first part of it speaks to the idea that everybody's behavior influences the behavior of people around them. And one of the things that comes up time and time again within TTF events is the idea that you could take a very well brought up, very well educated, civilized, humane graduate who's come out of university fresh with ideas, hasn't got a bad bone in his or her body. But if you put that kind of person into a poor, toxic, predatory culture, it's just a matter of weeks, months, years at tops before that person starts to behave in an inappropriate way. So culture obviously has a really big part to play here. And the last part of the sentence is exactly because of people like Joanne. We believe that the culture and the expectation should be that if something's happening that you're aware of that isn't right, it is your professional duty to respond to that and to blow the whistle, to report it to the authorities. And of course, that presupposes we have a regulatory framework that will protect such people. We're not sure we have that yet. And a corporate culture that will protect such people, and we're sure we don't have that yet either. So forgive me, I thought I would just jump in with those points before we move on to, I think Joanne was next actually. Let's go to Joanne and then we'll go to Kim. Joanne, your thoughts please on John and his wonderful book.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Jim for your comments. And I just wanted to pick up also what Jim said about ethics. The banks actually are regulated and have wonderful ethics and have excellent tools to help you be ethical. The thing is that it's used as a marketing tool to pacify customers and to think it's something you can trust. The truth is that it's not followed. So, you know, you have values you adhere to. It can be a disciplinary topic if you fail to meet or demonstrate those values. And they're things like respect, integrity, service, stewardship, leaving things better than you found them. They also give you tools such as what they call I won't mention the bank's name, but it was called the bank's name lens, which you could use as a tool to decide whether something was right or wrong. And it went something along the lines that if you would feel embarrassed to tell your family or friends about a particular incident, then you know it's wrong and you shouldn't be doing it and you should be speaking up. And, you know, you're even regulated by the FCA to speak up. So if you suspect something is wrong, whether you're right or wrong, but you believe it to be wrong and you do it for the right reasons, you must do it. And if you don't, you can get sanctioned for it, including imprisonment, so they say. But none of that is used. It's there just to pacify customers as far as I'm concerned. It's used as a marketing tool. It's not adhered to unless it suits the bank in some way, but certainly not done to protect customers. So they have everything you're mentioning is in place in theory, but not practice. And that's our problem. I think reading John's book as well, from what I take away from it is we have all these tools, we have all these expectations, but why don't we have adherence to it? And I think it comes down to the profit motive, and it comes down to banks putting either targets in place that are really onerous for staff to meet, and if they can't meet it, means their jobs are on the line, or it comes down to commissions, really healthy commissions that you want to obviously earn, and so you bend the rules and you forget about your ethics, and yeah, profit drives it. So, you know, I think that's what drives the breaches, that erodes people's ethics. People maybe don't start out wanting to do the wrong thing, but it's either fear or greed that drives them, whether it's the targets or whether it's the actual commissions that they're offered to do it. And then lastly, John, I wanted to mention about the artificial intelligence. I see that is something that is happening more and more. And even in the banks on the investment side, they now sit you down in front of a laptop or a computer and you go through a series of virtual questions and scenarios and videos to help you decide, you know, should you be investing? Are you a sophisticated investor or not? And that's now where you're getting your financial advice from. So Lloyd's is one of the banks that are actually using that, where you sit down and go through this virtual sort of journey to decide how you're going to invest. But it is rather sad that here in today's age, people can't just do the right thing, that we have to sit in front of artificial intelligence to get a fair deal. You know, we're just losing our humanity that way. Why can't people rather just do the right thing? And why can't it be that companies can make money doing the right thing? And certainly they'll be more sustainable. They might not make the great hits that they're making now through crookery, really, but they're going to be sustainable. We're not going to have these crash and burns all the time. So I think it's just that idea of, yes, it is probably a way, but how sad is that on humanity that we actually have to remove the salesperson in that process or the advisor in that process, because people can't be trusted. Because I think it's just very sad.
Yeah,
but very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can I just say one experience I had with one firm that was selling, I think it was investment products, and they had a bit of software because it all looked very clever. They got their computer out and they said, "Now tell us about this and tell us about that and what do you want to do and how do you?" And they put all this information and then they pressed the button. Oh, you should invest with us, right? Because it was all set up to do that every time, but it looked good. It was another sales marketing technique, wasn't it? So there isn't an easy way of dealing with that, which is why I think that the regulators will have to pay enormous attention to this software as it develops, so that they'll be regulating the software. They'll need to know, they'll have to have experts in this to check that the software is really doing what the company is saying it's doing. And don't forget this is a bit of software that's in between. It's selecting for you. It is the advisor rather than the provider. It's your own agent, your agent that's going to make the decisions for you. And that's the basis upon which that software should be constructed. It's got a duty to you. It's going to make sure that you get the best deal. And that's what the regulator will have to ensure happens.
One wonders, John, if the regulators are going to be more successful getting software to treat customers fairly than they have been getting people to. Fascinating stuff. This is a really interesting conversation, John. Really interesting. Let's go to Kim. I think Kim wanted to share some thoughts as well. Kim, over to you.
Well, I have lots of thoughts running around in my head. The first one is that I had a couple salespeople knock on my door who were trying to get me to change my energy choices. And that was only a couple weeks ago. So I've done nothing at this point, but it's good to know that at some point in time, which seemed to be 2 weeks ago, there were like 2 or 3 different companies down my same block, all trying to do the same thing. And so it's interesting that you said that the regulators had to step in and had to drive that good behavior. And I'm wondering why, well, all right, I'm not really wondering, we know why, but wondering why our regulators in financial services aren't stepping in more. But that's conversations that we've had in many other meetings, TTF meetings, and I'm sure we'll continue to have those same conversations. The other thing is my background is total rewards and mostly compensation. And, you incentivize behaviors. Those are the behaviors that you want. And you're going to incentivize those behaviors. So as a salesperson, Andy, you starting, in sales in financial services, why would you do anything but try to create sales that bring the objectives back to the company? So if we're going to have performance management systems that tie to pay, that then tie to objectives that aren't best for consumers, that's going to happen every day. And so I do believe a lot of it does start with the way that people are incentivized in corporations. And it's interesting, Jim, that you're talking about fairness. And John, I think you mentioned fair and being able to assess something if it's fair, but only if you have all of the information around it. And I think the problem is you will never have all of the information around it, because the people who don't want you to believe that it's unfair are not going to be transparent. They're not going to be authentic in providing that information to be able to say something is fair. So I always use the concept of fairness in terms of, if I was put in the position of a person, and Jim, I think you made a comment about, redundancy. If I was put in a position in that situation, which I was recently in any case, but I would feel like I was being treated fairly if the company was being extremely transparent as to why the decision was made, and then treated me in the right way afterwards. And I think where the fairness part comes in is that I don't know that leaders, and we should all be leaders top to bottom in the corporation, but I don't necessarily think that leaders are doing that type of job to ensure that there is transparency, that they live the values. So Joanne was mentioning values, right? That you know, we can see around us that every company has values and they all sound the same. And you know what? They're not living those values on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, Don, you mentioned corporate conscience. Having a corporate conscience, how do we get to that point as a society?
Well, it's very interesting to get the topic of remuneration. I wonder whether you've ever been in the situation where a sort of customer or stakeholder group has had the remuneration package put before them to see if they agree that the company ought to pay senior executives that amount of money. I mean, that might be one way, you see, of regulating it. The other thing that I just mentioned, actually, if you've got a competitive market, how come we never hear about the chief executive's pay and make a decision about that is whether that's a company we want to buy a product from or not? There ought to be competitive pressures there, surely, as well, shouldn't there? But there never is for some reason, probably because we never know what they're paid.
Well, to some extent they are. I mean, at least in the US, so as you can tell from my voice, probably I'm American by birth, and I've been here in the UK for a little over 10 years now. And, you know, in the US, for sure, there are public companies, the top X number of executives, you can go to the proxy and hear the CDNA and look at the compensation for those executives. But of course, there's ways to write them. You know, having been in executive compensation, there's certainly ways to provide that information to either be more transparent or less transparent to do that.
As always, it's very, very useful insight. Let's try and get some thoughts from Karl, and then, if possible, from Hannah and David Maxwell as well. So, Karl, your comments, please, your thoughts.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you, John, for a really interesting talk. That was really, as always, it was really, really good to hear you talk about these issues, especially giving you depth of your experience in these areas. I'd just like to throw in a bit of a challenge, really, which is I think there are some areas where it's not entirely it's not entirely clear where the appropriate dividing line is in terms of some of these points. So just a couple of examples. One is, I'm sure everyone remembers the man from the Prue, who for many years, probably over 100 years, provided financial advice to probably millions of people in the UK, not just the Prue, but also similar firms. Well, the man from the Prue has disappeared now. And the reason for the man from the Prue has disappeared is because it was simply too expensive to regulate a sales force of that size. And so the Prue and similar companies decided it wasn't worth them continuing with it. Yeah. Or it wasn't even possible to continue with it. And so there's a balance there between financial inclusion and so sort of an enhanced level of transparency and disclosure, for example, on the part of the sales force. And the other example is free current accounts, because I think we all enjoy free current accounts in the UK. We all enjoy, not paying charges on our normal banking, getting free withdrawals from cash machines. But the thought that always goes across my mind, apologies, I've got a visitor here. You can probably see, sorry about this. It always comes in from time to time. The thing that always goes across my mind whenever I'm using those free services is that it has to be paid by somebody. So somewhere in the bank's value chain, there's somebody paying more for a service than they might otherwise do. And I'm not entirely clear where the appropriate dividing line is. It seems with free current accounts, we've got a sort of custom and practice that accepts the current position. But is that fair for whoever it is paying more than they might otherwise do for other services? Yeah,
but free in credit banking is a really interesting topic, started by the Midland Bank, and I think about the 1970s, and they got a lot of business from it. So, of course, what happened if you've got this competitive survival of the fittest element working in the marketplace? Every other bank said, well, we've got to give free banking then to our in credit customers. Who's paying for it? Well, the people who aren't in credit. And that's usually the poorest and most vulnerable people in society who end up paying for the free banking that presumably we're all getting. And you have to ask yourself, overall, is that fair? I mean, it's unlikely we're going to vote for it to stop because we're getting the benefit of it. But would it be fairer? Would it be fairer to people who fall behind on their bank account if they weren't having to pay such high interest? Because that's how largely free if in credit banking is paid for. Yeah,
that's right. It's such a topical point. In fact, I think about 3 years ago, we ran a meeting in the House of Commons all about this issue to do with free if in credit bank charges. And I've just popped into the chat a link to the white paper. And I'm pleased to say that the regulators did make some changes after we proposed what we proposed. There is very often a tension between what's good for everybody and what's good for some parts of the system, and getting that balance right is often very, very difficult. David Maxwell, we can see you, we can hear you, because I think you're off mute. We'd love to hear you briefly introduce yourself, as you weren't with us at the beginning, and also please, David, share your thoughts on what we've been discussing. Thank you, David.
Yeah, apologies everyone. I just got caught up in another meeting. Yeah, I'm based in Northern Ireland, and up until lockdown, I would have been in London every week. I work in corporate finance and advisory and small business, and also I manage the family property, commercial property interests, so which keeps me busy. So, but in relation to the book, I was intrigued just with when I read the summary, John, on the book. So I think I have it ordered. Well, it hasn't arrived yet. So what was the real motivation just for doing the book? Because I haven't heard, I've come in this late. So, and I know your background and what you've been doing in your past life.
Yeah, well, I think the motivation of it was trying to get thoughts in my own head straight, to be honest. I wasn't necessarily too worried about writing a bestseller, but I was trying to organize in my own mind, from my experience, what was going wrong, because it kept on going wrong. And there must have been some underlying reason for it. And I think that was largely because we had this interest in laissez-faire in the 2000s. The regulators operated a laissez-faire system based on Adam Smith's view of the marketplace. So the regulator didn't intervene terribly much. And that caused problems along the line. When we had the banking crash, the regulator, you could say, overreacted by intervening enormously in all sorts of directions to try and sort things out. But I'm still not sure that the interventions it ended up with were the right ones. The interventions that we've ended up with after the banking crash seem to me to be not addressing the actual problem, which was misselling, but trying to ensure that if misselling kept on happening, the banks were more able to cope with it, which I'm not sure was the right way of dealing with it. We want to really surely stop people being missold to, because that's where a lot of the damage comes from. So I was trying to get my own thoughts straight. And I was also trying to see whether we really learned any lessons. I took a walk before this session with my dog up on the downs nearby, where there is a Celtic barrow. It's about 3,500 years old. Unfortunately, four-wheel drive vehicle owners have decided it's a good lump in the ground to drive over, so they've started to destroy it, but someone's just come along and put some barbed wire around it. It's 3,500 years old. In those days, when there was a dispute about anything, the group of people in that tribe would all of them get together. They'd all really know the people involved and understand who they were. They'd understand the facts of what had gone wrong, and they would have a vote on whether they felt that person was guilty of something or whether they had been treated unfairly by someone else, and the community would communally come up with a decision. We've lost that in our judicial system. The only reference to it now is in criminal cases, where you get a representative 12 men and women, good and true, who will make a decision about a crime, but it's still 12 people, that they're representative of the community. And when it comes to civil cases, which is so many of the instances we're talking about misselling, it'll be a judge who decides, who's controlled by the law. He has no great opportunity to decide about something being fair, even if it's illegal, or unfair, even if it's legal. Because that's the nuance that you get within the community. People think things are fair when actually they might be unfair, or they might think it's unfair when actually it's lawful. So we've lost that democratic aspect of decision making. It's not down to the community anymore, and that's part of, I think, the feeling of disenfranchisement that you often get in society. Every politician at the election will say we must have a fair society. I don't know what fair means, but I mean, that's what it must have, fair society. And with a big chunk of our everyday life, there's no democratic aspect in the decision making. There's no democratic view of what is fair in any particular situation. So it was going through that process that I ended up writing this book, trying to put in my own mind some of these ideas in a logical way. I'm still not convinced I've got it there completely, but it lent me along an interesting trail.
Great stuff. John, thank you very much for that response. I feel compelled to share my screen again, so bear with me, folks, while I do that, because I want to show you this. Some of you would have seen this before because I mention it quite frequently. This is a US database called Violation Tracker. It does exactly what it says. It tracks violations, and it's massive. There are 444,000 civil and criminal cases captured within this database from over 250 government agencies. So it's a serious piece of work. It's a very serious piece of work. Now, what is amazing about it is this: if you click on offence group totals, sorry, if you click on industry totals, you get a ranking of how bad the industries are. So can you see at the very top, we've got financial services. That doesn't surprise me at all. It really doesn't surprise me at all. I think there are all sorts of reasons why financial services, because it's dealing with invisible abstract concepts where it's quite easy to trick people. It's not like if you were to go and buy a Hoover that didn't work properly, 2 days later you take it back to the shop and get your money back. Financial services is much more complex than that. You might not know that you've been stitched up for 20 years. But it wasn't surprising that financial services comes out worst. What was surprising was just how bad it is compared to the others. So 330 billion, not million, 330 billion dollars worth of fines since the year 2000. This is the second worst industry is pharmaceuticals, with just, inverted commas, 50 billion. So financial services is something like 6 or 7 times worse. Oil and gas is third, motor vehicles, etc., etc., etc. So the ability to actually track what individual organizations are doing in terms of infringements is a really powerful thing if what you want is to improve the way the system works. And in this particular database, if you click on financial services, it will take you to the worst offenders. Bank of America is the worst, then JP Morgan Chase, then Citigroup. John made a really powerful point earlier. These are big brands, household name organizations. Wells Fargo is there at 4th. There's a wonderful film/documentary we'll be covering in one of our film club sessions called Wagon Wheel. It's all about how Wells Fargo were fabricating bank accounts. Basically, it would appear, allegedly, because the more accounts that were opened, the more favorable the stock market analysts would think of the firm. That would impact share price, that would impact chief exec pay. We spoke about remuneration earlier. And you've then got this list of all the actual individual infringements by the banks. Where this gets important and where this gets books like John's right up there in terms of importance is recidivism. Recidivism is where organizations or individuals do the same things over and over again. And the real worry for me is this: is the profit motive so strong that it actually pays banks to carry on doing bad. These are huge amounts of money that they're being fined. But if you're the chief executive of a bank and your share price is linked to your remuneration package, maybe the incentive is strong enough to turn a blind eye. Maybe that's why PPI became such a big problem, as John was alluding to earlier. So these folks are very, very important issues. As it happens, on Tuesday next week, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m, we've got an event happening all about that, all about the building back better agenda, all about trying to build a fairer society post-COVID. I'll just put a link into the chat if any of you would like to go to it. You're very welcome to do so. Let's see if we can get a comment from Hannah. Hannah, can we?
I'm going to interrupt you even before you invite Hannah to speak,
yes,
Andy,
yes,
because
please
we're very fortunate to have Hannah here.
Okay.
Because she's the former payment services regulator.
Oh,
and
wow.
she was also at Ofgem when I was there, so she knows a lot of the details of what I was involved in. She may well not agree with anything I've said. Hannah,
let's see. Hannah, please share us your thoughts. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, John, for that introduction. Sorry, I can't share my video because I'm competing for broadband with my kids. So, in the interest of keeping the sound quality, I won't share the video. So. John's right. I mean, I've got an ex-regulator background. I'm currently non-exec at Thames Water and National Grid, which are both regulated companies, and keen interest in regulation generally. And it's been a really interesting conversation. I'm sorry I missed the first part of it, John, because these are issues that we obviously grappled with at Ofgem. I've seen other regulators, including the FCA, which is a sister regulator to the payment systems regulator, grapple with these problems. And I was sort of reflecting on the comments and more generally about how do you deal with this, and the principles that the FCA put in place. And I was not part of this. This is just as an outside observer. Were an attempt to do that. And I think when they first went in, companies probably took them reasonably seriously, but of course they haven't been enforced against. And then they probably become less seriously taken by companies, which is probably a natural response. So what do you do about that? And I think the problem is that for the FCA or any regulator to enforce against a principle, the standard is a legal one, whereas the standard you've been talking about was, I think somebody called it a democratic one. Now that's not something a regulator can enforce against. So, perhaps that means regulators need to be a bit braver on this, and at least even if you're losing court on it, ultimately you're on the right side of the argument. So maybe there is an argument for being a bit braver. But I'm quite attracted to John's suggestion of having these sort of consumer-based, call them councils or whatever, in companies. I mean, lots of regulators use them. Lots of regulated companies use them because they're required to do so by the regulator. Certainly in energy, National Grid has one, for example. Thames Water has one. And actually, maybe that's a way of getting the regulated companies, particularly in financial services, to have that sort of be held up to that democratic standard, because the legal standards, it's almost impossible for a regulator, because unless something has manifestly gone wrong, because it did in PPI, and you can say, look, there's so obviously a problem here, it's very hard to enforce against those principles. And of course, at that point, it's just too late from a customer perspective. So, I was actually quite attracted by this idea of getting the conscience, I think she put it, John, into the corporate entity, perhaps the regulator tying that, actually requiring that and tying it to the principle, so that each year that consumer council, whatever you're going to call it, has to publicly report about how it's carried out its function. And that might be a way of introducing that democratic standard into and tying it to a regulatory legal standard.
Yeah. Well, Hannah, it's great you've joined the conversation, and thank you very much. And I certainly like the idea, and I joined the customer engagement group for Scottish Power Energy Networks because I wanted to see how that was working, because it's only just been introduced into the energy sector. I'm not sure that it's been got right, but I'll develop my thoughts on that a bit more. But it is quite a powerful tool. Just from what we've done so far, we can see that we've made a significant difference to the business plan of Scottish power energy networks in the next price control round. I won't go into all the details of what that's all about, but we have made a significant difference. And every time I've been on one of these committees, and Karl will substantiate this with Scottish Widows and Lloyds Banking Group, that on the Independent Governance Committee and the With Profits Committee, you could really make a difference. You could hold the company's feet to the fire, and that's what these groups, I think, are really all about. And Karl, I think you're on another IGC now as well, aren't you? So you've experienced two in that situation. You're doing it presumably because you feel you can make a difference. So, do you want to say anything about that? You're muted at the moment, but
yeah. So sorry, John. Yeah, full disclosure. So I was on the With Profits Committee at Scottish Widows with John, and I'm currently on the corresponding With Profits committees for Aviva and for Royal London. So I think just a little bit of background. These committees came out of the Equitable Life scandal 20 years ago, when I think customers lost out significantly because of the actions of Equitable Life Management. So the FSA, I think it was, the predecessor to the FCA, established a system where larger firms need to have a largely independent committee to oversee their actions on with profits funds. So this is around things like investment strategy, bonus rates payable to customers on those policies, and also extending into areas like customer communications, for example. So I think John could attest, we also got involved in looking at the actual information that was sent out to customers. So I think it's quite a big step forward, I think, but on a relatively limited block of business. So just for with profits contracts, so not for the business as a whole. But I think certainly my experience on the committees I've been involved in has been that you really do have the ear of management, because they recognise that this is a voice they need to take notice of, and to ensure that you know, the interests of customers, insofar as we were able to represent them, are properly reflected.
I'm going to work my way through a few quick points before passing over to John to kind of bring the session to a close, if I may. Much of the last 5 or 10 minutes has been around the idea that more kind of democratic input by ordinary consumers could make a difference. And I'm very pleased to tell you that that particular theme was a key part of the Transparency Task Force's recent submissions to the consultations by HM Treasury and the Treasury Select Committee. The idea that there ought to be proper, you know, people power input into the regulatory framework. And we didn't just kind of make our ideas up, but our ideas were significantly influenced by developments in Australia. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that Australia's gone through a Royal Commission looking at gross misconduct down under, which has led to all kinds of seismic reshaping of the financial services landscape there. And in Australia, what they are now doing is they are creating what you can think of as an oversight body, which is designed specifically to prevent regulatory capture, which is recognized as a big, big problem in all markets, particularly financial services. There's nothing new about that. This goes back to the 19th century. It was well, you know, documented as an issue. And what they're doing in Australia is they're creating this body that will hold the regulators to account properly, without in itself being captured. Now, without being too cynical, I'm going to share my screen again and show you a particular couple of pages here. What you're looking at now, and please don't misunderstand me, I really do think the Financial Services Consumer Panel has the potential to be a very, very powerful force for good. But one of the reasons why some people believe it is becoming a very, very watered down version of itself compared to when folks like John were in charge is demonstrated admirably on their own website. So, for example, if you go to the What is the Panel page, it says all the right things. That page basically says the purpose of the Financial Services Consumer Panel is to hold the regulator to account. to speak up on behalf of consumers, etc. It's exactly what you would expect it to be. However, and I think this is a big problem, if you then go to who is on the panel, if you read the first couple of sentences, it basically says that membership of the Financial Services Consumer Panel is constructed to represent the various sectors within which regulated financial businesses operate. Now that to me sounds like it's kind of speaking to the industry rather than for consumers, comma, this is the worrying bit, often based on nominations made by trade associations. Trade associations represent the industry. So I would argue that this webpage in and of itself points to the kind of conflicts of interest that can come about when you don't have very, very robust regulatory scrutiny. And that theme, the lack of regulatory scrutiny, was a big theme in the Financial Services Bill going through the House of Lords last week, when people like Baroness Kramer, Baroness Bowles, Lord Sharkey, Lord Eatwell, Baroness Bennett, and many others were all basically saying the regulatory framework is not transparent enough, does not have enough pro-consumer influence, and lacks scrutiny. And I'm very pleased to say, and this is before I pass over to John, that that we the TTF, despite the fact that we really have very little resource, we are the secretariat to a new all-party parliamentary group, the all-party parliamentary group on personal banking and fairer financial services. We've got lots of very pro-consumer minded MPs involved. Here they are. I'll just scroll down very, very quickly. And we've also got many, many TTF members who have become involved with the secretariat for this APPG. And I'll just show some of them here. We even have Sue Lewis, who, like John Howard, is a former chair of the Financial Services Consumer Panel. So if anybody wants to know more about this or might want to get involved, please do just say. This gentleman here, Dr. Andy Schmulo, he's an academic in Australia. He's the chap that's written the piece of legislation, or he's been involved with writing the legislation that the Australians are going to be absorbing to try to create this pro-consumer oversight body. And I'm very, very pleased to say, and any of you who know the man will realise what a breakthrough this is. On the 24th of March at 8 AM, 8 o'clock in the morning UK time, we have a UK plus UK plus Australia symposium. We haven't publicly announced this yet, but the keynote speaker is Kenneth Haynes himself. He's the man that led the Royal Commission in Australia. So this is the guy at the very, very apex of the world's regulatory thought leadership. Let me put it that way. A very, very significant fellow. And it's a huge compliment to TTF that he's speaking at our events, because he never speaks at events, but he's going to be speaking at ours. And anybody that's interested in regulation and what's needed to regulate the future effectively should come along to it. The title is going to be "How Would a Good Regulator Function?" or something like that. 8 AM to 10 AM on the 24th of March. Don't miss it. We've got some incredible speakers involved, including hopefully some peers from the UK, as well as some serious heavyweights from Australia. On that note, I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to say. I would be delighted, John, if you'd like to share with us some final thoughts about what you perhaps hope your book might help to achieve, and about where you think the energy should be going moving forward. And if you don't mind, John, just kind of share with us your final thoughts, then we'll close the session. Thank you, John.
All right, Andy, thank you very much indeed. This has been smashing, actually, and thank you everyone for coming along and contributing. Some really interesting thoughts have come out of it. As you were all introducing yourselves and saying what you've done in the past, it struck me that there were synergies with the themes that I had, some of the themes I'd outlined in my book, which was fascinating to see that you were coming from different perspectives, but were recognizing some of the same issues. That was fascinating. I'm still forming my own views really about how we tackle some of this, and the idea of the consumer or customer representative groups, I think, needs more work doing to it. As I say, I'm on one in the energy sector that I don't think is working as well as it could, but I'm hoping by the end of my time being involved with it that I can come to a clearer view of how it might be operating better. They have similar bodies in the water sector, as Hannah will know, and they are also, I think, perhaps not working at their optimum. Use that word.
Yeah.
So there is plenty of work more to do in that direction. Andy, I think what you're doing with the Transparency Task Force is fantastic. So much of being fair requires you to be transparent, which is why I'm involved with the Transparency Task Force, and all power to you in all the things that you're doing. It's been really nice to meet you, Kim, Mech, Joanne and Jim. Thank you very much for attending.
John.
And David Maxwell. And Hannah and Karl, I hope I see you both before too long. It's been nice that you've joined us, and thank you very much indeed for your contribution. I'll leave it there though, Andy. Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you very
Really
much, John.
appreciate
Thank you
it.
very much, Andy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed.
Have a
Super stuff.
fantastic